Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm just going to jump right in. It's wonderful to have you with me today, Kent. We're just meeting today, and I'm excited to get this conversation started. So I think I'm going to start with a really serious topic, and we'll leave a little bit of room at the end if you have questions. We'll kind of cover hopefully a lot of territory in this short period. So first, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's brought a lot of different digital topics and digital inequities to the fore. One of the things that I've seen as a free expression activist and an expert on content moderation in particular is the way in which companies have dedicated quite a bit of resources, I would say, to Ukraine, and often in some ways that some of my colleagues would point out in ways that they did not to other conflicts like Syria. So in this case, we've seen a lot of exceptions that have been made for Ukraine specifically, not necessarily by Google, but by other companies to allow, for example, for certain types of hate speech or calls for violence that otherwise wouldn't be allowed. So I'm curious to kind of get your broad take on this, how Google approaches Ukraine, conflict more generally, and what the company's doing to ensure that Ukrainians, as well as others living in conflict zones, are able to access and use Google's various tools.
It's a great question, Jillian. For starters, thank you. Thank all of you for the opportunity to be here. The Ukraine situation was an extraordinary one, is an extraordinary one. It calls for extraordinary measures. But we've also tried to respond in a principled way that's consistent with the policies we've put out to deal with similar situations around the world. We've long had a policy against denying the tragic events, whether the Holocaust or mass shootings. And when we saw disinformation coming across our platforms, we actually took very strong action, suspending RT, Sputnik, and thousands of other channels that were spreading disinformation in Ukraine, in Russia, and around the world. In addition to that, we've tried very hard to promote authoritative information. That's one of the things Google tries to do best on our services, with top news shelves, breaking news shelves, even SOS alerts for people in Ukraine so they could have access to immediately relevant information for humanitarian services and warnings of missile attacks. We actually put out air raid alerts working with the Ukrainian government. We've also tried to work on the cybersecurity side to defend people in Ukraine and elsewhere from cyber attacks, whether that's attacks on their Gmail through our advanced protection program, which is a kind of enhanced multi-factor authentication, to trying to defend journalists and government agencies through something called Project Shield. This is a defense against DDoS attacks, where it's relatively easy to DDoS a small website, but it's harder to DDoS Google. And so if we can extend our security umbrella to some of these other services, for whether they're journalists, human rights activists, et cetera, we think that's a win for the cause of free information and human rights around the world. But to close out, we know we can't do this by ourselves. We need to work with a broader community of governments, civil society, NGOs, to make sure that accurate information is flowing freely and that people have access to it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm just curious as well, do you feel like this is something where some of the tools that have been put in place, particularly with this conflict, can be expanded to other conflicts globally? Or are we going to see some of these same measures taken with respect to conflicts elsewhere in the Middle East and so forth?
These are always going to be case-by-case determinations. This was an extraordinary case where you have the United Nations, for example, voting 141-5 to condemn the invasion. And that was what helped make it easier for us to say this was, in fact, disinformation. We have to evaluate new developments as they come in different conflict settings around the world. The general topic of disinformation is a really challenging one. We've taken a lot of steps over the years to block foreign state actor interference. But misinformation, political debate is a more charged area, and we're looking for, where we can, to anchor our determinations based on the decisions of government authorities, democracies, and other sort of scientific consensus.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move to another topic that's really near and dear to my heart and really does relate back to this one. So sanctions. We know that Russia has been subject to a number of sanctions, but over the years, Iran has been the target of broad sanctions from various governments, including the US government. Of course, Google is ultimately a US company. Now, Who's responsible for these sanctions is, of course, the US government, but tech companies have to apply them, and often, in my opinion, go a bit too far in legal measures or in their legal interpretations to apply these sanctions. So I'm going to give an example here. There's a general license that advocates from Iran and from the international community fought for many years and successfully achieved under the Obama administration that allows tech that's used for communications technology to be used in countries under sanctions, and Iran specifically. Advocates were successfully pushed GitHub, which went to great lengths to make sure that they had the right licenses so that Iranians could use their services. But Google is one of the largest global tech giants, and yet it still blocks certain services and has actually even recently gone further to identify people's locations even when they're using a VPN and block them from those services. Now, I'm sympathetic to the companies. I understand, you do have to legally comply, but I'm curious, what is Google doing to push the State Department on this, and what more can we do to help, serve that cause?
Yeah, it's a great example of where we can collaborate on some of these things. The core mission of Google is and always has been to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And that inherently means we are committed to trying to provide services wherever we can within the bounds of the law. Now, as you say, we have to comply with legal sanctions, as we do in the cases against Russia and elsewhere, and Iran. But it's also the case that a number of Google services are available in Iran. Our communication services, including search and maps and Gmail, are all available in Iran. There are cases where the local government actually is doing the blocking for some of our services, so we have to be mindful of that as well. But the general notion of trying to figure out how civil society, companies can work together to promote constructive access to tools that can be used by human rights activists in country while honoring the intent of sanctions it's an ongoing conversation.
Indeed. Is Google working with the State Department on this?
We work constantly with the U.S. State Department and other sanctions authorities around the world to understand exactly the parameters across our many different services. We are trying to provide access to information while complying with law, and sometimes that's a gray area and we need to get more definition.
Great. Thank you for that. We'll definitely follow up. Okay, I want to come to a topic that I think is a pretty hot one today. We talked about it on an earlier panel, and you might have heard from some of my panelists about the impact of certain terrorism regulations, including in the EU, as well as from companies, and the way that impacts human rights advocates, journalists, and others. So I'm going to pull up an old quote. I know you may not have been at Google at the time, but in 2008, former CEO Eric Schmidt famously stood up to Senator Joseph Lieberman in the US, and he demanded, when Lieberman demanded that YouTube censor videos from Al-Qaeda. Google actually pushed back and said, no, we're not going to take these down, and then later relented a little bit and took down those that specifically contained violent content. But over the years, and as I documented in a lot of my work, the rise of ISIS or ISIL, and later the Christchurch massacre, have led to greater demands from the public, from politicians, from a lot of society to block and take down terrorist content. And what we've seen is automation being used, often in ways that can be detrimental, again, to human rights documentation. YouTube is one of the culprits in this. And so I'm really curious, sort of what you, as an insider, how you've seen Google change internally on this over the years, and really what Google's doing now to work with civil society and others to ensure that that kind of documentation from places like Syria is able to be seen by the world and witnessed.
So it's an important topic, and again, I go back to our core information mission and information access mission. We are, when confronted with situations like this, trying to figure out how best to strike that appropriate balance. I've been at Google for a while, so I was actually around in 2008. And I will say we've evolved over time. I think we came up with a pure notion of more communication would be better. And over time, when we saw terrorist abuse of our services, the kinds of things you talked about, hate speech, Christchurch, et cetera, we have evolved and taken a number of steps to try and deal with problems of hate speech, terrorist content, and the like. Some of that has been changes to policies. Some of that has been changes to enforcement using enhanced tools, because at the scale that we deal with, we need to use automated tools to at least make the first order cut with regard to blocking information before it becomes live and actually causes harm or radicalizes people and the like. But it's always a balance, and we want to be very mindful of the concerns of the human rights community. We engage regularly with human rights groups and others to make sure we're trying to get that balance. We are getting that balance right. Your point about making sure we are aware of the context of material that's being uploaded is a very important one, because something that's being used for incitement or to radicalize in a different context might actually be a record being made by a human rights activist to document government abuses or other sorts of problematic content. We've had situations where we've gotten that wrong. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, we had a situation where YouTube had removed content because it had graphic violence associated with it. And then we subsequently learned that the poster was a human rights activist who was working to document government abuses, and we restored that content. Similarly, in Ukraine, we face a situation where some content being uploaded to YouTube might, in some context, violate our policies, but where it's being used for human rights advocacy, that puts a very different context, a very different framing around that, and we're trying to be mindful of that as well.
I'm going to follow up on that. I'm really curious. Do you feel that, I think automation is being used at a great scale today, and we know that, and I'm not going to quote myself on this because I'm not so familiar with exactly how Google uses it, but we know that it's being used to identify information, but sometimes to take it down as well without review. I'm curious to get your take. How effective do you really believe that automation is in these cases? And do you feel that there's, more room for Google to expand on things like appeals and ensuring that there's more transparency around that?
So we've made dramatic strides in the accuracy of the tools, including artificial intelligence, that we use to recognize some of these images. If you remember a few years ago, there were images of captives being marched down the beach in orange jumpsuits before they were being beheaded. We can actually use artificial intelligence to recognize similar imagery that was being used to terrorize or to radicalize. And that's very valuable. We can actually block those images from being uploaded in the first place. Now, as you suggest, it's also important that you have a robust appeal process so that if we're making the wrong decisions in these cases, there are channels and opportunities for people to say, no, as with the example I gave a moment ago, the context for this upload is actually different. I'm trying to criticize some of this, or I'm trying to provide news coverage of something here. And we very much take that into account across YouTube and our other services. So the tools have gotten much better. They're not perfect, and they probably never will be perfect. Something people don't always recognize is that 15% of the queries going into Google search on any given day we have never seen before. This notion of constant newness, the endless inventiveness of people and new news coming every day means that the AI can really only be trained on the past. We need human intelligence to help us anticipate what's coming down the pike.
So I want to follow up on something, because you said upload filters, and upload filters are used to prevent content from being seen before it even reaches. I messed that one up, but it prevents it from being seen, basically. But how then can appeals work with upload filters? I think that's the biggest concern that I've heard from human rights advocates, is that if it's never seen in the first place, how can people appeal those decisions?
The uploader gets notice that their content violated our policies one way or the other, much the way we would do for copyright infringement or other kinds of materials where we recognize the same content that someone is trying to re-upload. If they upload an infringing version and the same version gets uploaded a second time, we will block that, but we will tell them why. So they'll have an opportunity to say, no, this was fair use, or this was otherwise, this was licensed content, or this was news coverage, or whatever else it was. So we have a robust process for that.
Okay, so Google is fully committed to human appeals in that instance?
Yeah, we do honor appeals, and in fact, through the process of the Digital Services Act, we are going to have an even more robust appeals process going forward, as well as more transparency into our decisions, because we're going to be finding ways to work with human rights advocates, academics, government regulators, et cetera, pursuant to the rules that are going to be set out in the DSA, and it's still kind of a work in progress. But we will find ways to shed more light on the work that we're doing without providing so much granular exposure of algorithms that they can be exploited by people who are trying to game the systems and spread misinformation, disinformation.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, we'll leave room for questions if folks want to follow up on the DSA. I'm not going to make a fool out of myself as a non-detailed policy person up here. But I do want to ask you another question that's kind of personal for me in my relationship with Google over the years. I hope you won't mind. So many years ago, maybe some of you know this, but Google played a pretty strong role in bringing together civil society advocates. This was maybe a different era, so it was around the time of my first Republica, I think, 2010, where Google convened a conference in Budapest called Internet at Liberty, and had activists from across the Arab region as well as Europe and other parts of the world. Thank you. 15 minutes, excellent. And that was a really special moment. At the same time, there were, of course, plenty of critics who felt that this was not the role of a corporation to do this. But I do think for a lot of people it made a difference, and Google was kind of a big funder of civil society at the time, and played an important role there. But I've seen that kind of wane over the years, and I'm curious from your perspective if Google has kind of backed away from that because of that criticism, or if this is just an area where Google doesn't want to play a part anymore.
It honestly doesn't feel to me as though we backed away. I'm coming right now from having spoken in Stockholm at the Institute for International Affairs and met with a number of NGOs. Tomorrow I'm going to Copenhagen to speak at the Summit on Democracy. We've been engaging with the US with the various convenings of human rights and civil rights organizations. We participated in the Biden administration Summit on Democracy a little while ago. We're very engaged in standard setting around the world, which is a mix of engineering, but also civil society commentators and people who are helping to influence those standards. Our Google.org team is actually supporting a lot of NGOs who are using AI for good, tech for social impact, et cetera. So in some ways, it's a even more global and more distributed conversation than it was a few years ago. So maybe it may feel as though the conversation has gotten broader, if less intense, because we've brought more voices, more different parts of society into the room. Some who are advocating for privacy, some for competition, some for content moderation. But that's a rich, yeasty discussion, and we really lean into that. I think it's critical.
All right, thank you. Do you have any questions for me before we turn it over to the audience?
I'd be interested in understanding from EFF's perspective, and we've partnered for a long time. We actually have former EFF folks working at Google. How do you see the world having changed? How has your work changed in the last 10 years?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, when I think back to that era 10, 11 years ago, I saw it as a much less diverse space, certainly. I think a lot of the folks advocating for digital rights were very focused on a few core issues, issues that are still near and dear to my heart, but that often didn't take into account the perspectives of people from the global south or the rest of the world, let's say. And I think that that's where a lot of my concerns today come in, that we're still not hearing those voices. But I think, on the other hand, we at EFF, as well as other advocacy organizations, have also made much bigger strides to work with a broader coalition, not just from the rest of the world, but with LGBTQ organizations, sex worker organizations, all sorts of other advocates from across the political spectrum who, are fighting for, or whose rights are fundamentally linked to digital rights. And that's something that I think a lot of us were blind to a decade ago. At the same time, I think that there's been a bit of a divergence between civil society and companies on a lot of these issues. Of course, we're still always pretty close when it comes to copyright issues for the most part. I know I get called a Google shill sometimes for our positions. But when it comes to, content moderation, free expression, I do see kind of a divide there. And I do worry that companies, certainly not just Google, but that companies aren't always hearing from people outside of the global north. And that, I'd say, would be my biggest takeaway, at least from today.
No, and just to echo that, I think it's extraordinarily important. We are expanding our operations, whether in India, the Middle East, Africa, LATAM, precisely to make sure we're hearing from local concerns. We have this kind of clumsy word, glocal. We're trying to simultaneously be consistent globally but responsive locally without setting problematic precedents that can be used in terrible ways. So it's very much a work in progress, but I welcome the notion of bringing more people into the conversation.
Excellent. I love that. Well, in the spirit of that, let's get more people into the conversation. I think we've got 10 minutes for questions, so I'm just going to get right to it. I can't really see, so I'm going to trust the folks with the mics.
I'm here to help you. Please let us know. Let the microphone come to you. We just need your signal if you have any questions or comments for our panel. Yes, over there, please. We have Lisa coming to you. Please, can you show your hand again so that Lisa can find you? Please give it up for Lisa and all our volunteers here.
Hi. First of all, thank you really much. And you said that Google's really closely cooperating with the legal processes in the whole government process, so that like there's a really close cooperation. And still, I think a lot of people can agree that the copyright laws worldwide are a pretty big mess. So what has to change in your opinion so that like frameworks can get better for content creators on the one side and for Google in like really identifying what's a problem regarding copyright infringement, and like where should the future go in this direction in general? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have thoughts, and you, Jillian, I'm sure have thoughts as well. You should jump in. I would start with the notion of fair use, which is the US version. In the UK, it's fair dealing. It's not as widely adopted elsewhere in the world. And this is a concept that we think is key to rich community conversation, that we ought to be able to create by standing on each other's shoulders, that there's a role for parody, for satire, for criticism, that's sometimes not recognized by all copyright laws around the world. So having broader international agreement on what that should look like is challenging because not all countries necessarily agree. But if we could expand that circle to a wider acceptance of these kinds of pro-social uses, I think that would be a step in the right direction. Jillian?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would say, I think, frankly, that Content ID has been a disaster. That it, regularly, routinely takes down content that is fair use, and that it doesn't, for me, from my perspective, bode very well for automation in other circumstances. So that's my key concern today.
Okay, please let us know, because it's hard for us to see from here. We need your hand. Right? Yes,
See
thanks.
one over there.
Okay. And maybe already give us a signal for the next one or two questions. Thanks.
Hello, I have a question about Saudi Arabia. There is a Google data center that's happening inside Saudi Arabia that will cover all the MENA region. So my question is, Google has mentioned that they have done human rights due diligence, and Aramco is a state-owned company. So there's a lot of human rights abuse that potentially that might happen in our data. Do you have any information about this project?
So I can say, as we expand Google Cloud, we are trying to provide services widely, and that means having data in different regions around the world. But we are very mindful of human rights concerns as we do that. So part of our review, part of our role in the GNI, the Global Network Initiative, is to make sure that we have a robust human rights review before we launch new services and open new offices, because of the risk that governments could overreach and try to infringe human rights. So as we decide where to build and as we operate, we're keeping these thoughts very front of mind to make sure we minimize the risk of human rights abuses on any of our tools.
Any more questions? Do you have any questions on our audience, or more prepared?
I mean, I can. I gotta say, I'm gonna follow up on that one. Forgive me, and it's okay if you don't have the answer, but are human rights really possible in a country that has murdered journalists with impunity? Saudi Arabia? I mean, I gotta ask, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think that the data centers serve the entire region, right? So it's a question of being able to make sure you're providing legitimate service, everyday services for retail, for agriculture, for banking, et cetera. And that's the vast majority of work that's being done here. But you want to make sure you have safeguards and guardrails in place to minimize the potential for these kinds of abuses. And nobody wants to be in a position in which their services are being compromised or abused. So we are taking steps there, and in many countries around the world, to make sure that we have the ability to review government requests for data, for example, and publish transparency reports about the work that we're doing. So we were the first company, I believe, of the large internet platforms to put out public transparency reports that index the number of requests we're getting from different governments, talking about how we respond and how much we push back. And in many cases, we do push back on these requests when we feel they are overbroad or potentially violate human rights. And that's a form of accountability that I think is very important as we go forward and something we're committed to.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Do we have any more questions, or are we at time?
Well,
You can ask me one if you want.
No. Let me just wrap up by thanking you all. We've been at Republica for some years now, and we very much benefit from the back and forth and hearing what on people's minds. And we look forward to engaging with you collectively like this, but also individually. As you have individual thoughts, we have a booth outside with some of our folks who are very eager to hear your thoughts and concerns and suggestions about how we could do better. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.